Is started. I'm going to mute everybody in the room. Don't be alarmed. I'm going to unmute you during the Q&A period if you have a question. Okay, and now I'm going to unmute Bridget Maley so she can begin her presentation. Bridget, you are ready to begin.
Great. Well, I have to say I've never done this before, and so I'm excited to have entered the next level of technology in terms of presenting. This is very exciting. So just a little bit quickly about me. One little thing is that I've been working in preservation in California for 20 years, and I noticed when John we have the benefit, the speakers, of knowing who's out there listening. And I just want to say hello to Phyllis Mueller because she was one of my first clients at the City of Anaheim. So hi, Phyllis. I hope you're well. Anyway, yeah, we're here to talk about updating historic resource surveys, how to do it, how to think about planning for these things as you move forward as a city, and you know, when to update resource surveys, how to raise the funds to do that, and all these things. So, moving on. So the planning director says to the historic preservation planner, what? You want to do what? But we updated our historic resources survey 30 years ago. An audible sigh was heard from the historic preservation planner. Here he is behind his desk, looking for money, looking for lots of money. Oh, the trials and tribulations of managing historic resource information at the local level. So why do you need to update your community's historic resource survey? When and why, and how do you fund it? So those are the questions we want to cover today. Well, you definitely want to do it before this happens, before you're ready to demolish a building. So you want to avoid mistakes. So an important reason to update your historic resource survey is to understand the historic resources that you have so that you avoid the last-minute trauma and anguish over the demolition of a significant building or the alteration of an older building that hasn't been fully assessed. So this little cartoon I thought was funny. It says, it isn't gingerbread at all. It's just plain old pumpernickel. So you want to update your survey because you want to know what the buildings are and what they have to share with your community. So it helps you provide additional information to the record that may be more readily available. And we have so much improved research methods now, and they've changed over the years. We have so much more that's available online and through the digital world. You can use tools like Ancestry.com to find an amazing level of information. We have wonderful resources at the state level, through the state library, and through the university levels to look for and find information without even leaving your office or your house. One of the things that is remarkable to me is the level of information you can now find through the census records so easily. You just have to pop onto Ancestry.com and type in a name and a year, and you can find so much. And you know, years ago when you had to do this manually, it would take time and effort in front of a microfilm machine or flipping through microfiche pages, and it just it wasn't feasible to do before, but now it's so much easier. We have a wealth of amazing photographs online now through libraries, through historical societies, through university collections. You can literally, through the San Francisco Public Library, for instance, you can type in an address and a photo will pop up in an instant, whereas before you would have to go to the library, look through the information, find it, then beg to get a copy of it. So it's so much easier now, and we can really augment the historic record so much better than we could before. Another tool that's online, for instance, is city directories. Many of these are online through archive.org. If you've never used archive.org, get online. So another reason to update a historic resource survey is because in the past we primarily looked at buildings as architectural elements. We didn't look at their cultural significance. So now we look to things a little bit differently, and we think about buildings as part of a greater landscape and part of a greater culture, and that the building might not necessarily be important for its architecture. It may have a significance that's related to its use historically, or to an important person that was linked to it, or to a cultural group. So we're able, again, with the tools that I just talked about, find out so much more about the building other than who it was designed by and what its architecture is. So some examples of that, just we look differently at cultural groups throughout California now, and we try to understand immigration patterns and how people traveled here and came to California over time. And one of those stories can be found in Angel Island, which is a wealth of information and has an archival collection too through the National Archives that we can understand the immigration patterns into California as they occurred decade by decade. But also, just specifically with this particular site, it was looked at so much differently. Before, a whole set of carved characters, Chinese characters, were found in the barracks building. So now, previously we looked at this site sort of from its military history and from its immigration history, but now the site is appreciated so much more as a collection of stories about people who were detained here, who came to California seeking a better life, but ended up living in a very sort of dismal place for a period of time. Another story that we can tell now that we wouldn't necessarily have told in the past, San Francisco's North Beach, which has been surveyed greatly, and we understand the buildings from their architectural perspective in a very detailed way. But over time, we've learned that there are other stories to be told about North Beach than just that it was the heart of Italian San Francisco. We now know that, well, this is an example of an old survey form. This is a survey form from the San Francisco's 1976 architectural survey is what it was called. So it was definitely looking at buildings. And you can see, I don't know if you can zoom in, but you can see that there were rankings, and there was a notes page and a picture of the building, and that's really was all there was. There wasn't a lot about the story of the building. There is a brief note on this particular form that says that the building was used as the Black Cat Cafe. But it turns out that the Black Cat Cafe is a very important place within the gay and lesbian community, and it was one of the first gathering places for members of this particular community. And now we know so much more about how this particular building was used during this era and under this context than we did before. So we also now have the benefit of a different set of criteria than were used for many of the historic resource surveys that are older. I know a lot of the smaller communities that I work with in Northern California have surveys that are, really 30 years old. Some of them are, late 1980s, and so they didn't have the benefit of using the California Register criteria. Some of them didn't even use really the National Register criteria. They just maybe had a local set of criteria, or they had a numerical set of rankings like the one I showed you for San Francisco. And the major benefit, I think, with using the California Register criteria sort of across the state is we have a way statewide to understand historic resources. But it also provides us with some alternative language about integrity than the National Register. So the guidelines for the California Register say it is possible that historic resources may not retain sufficient integrity to meet the criteria for listing in the National Register, but they may still be eligible for listing in the California Register. And this, I think, is an important point in terms of looking at resources at the local level. And my very early experience with this was looking at resources on Cannery Row in Monterey. I'm not going to remember the exact scenario, but this may have been, I don't know, a couple years after the California Register regs were adopted. And when you think about Cannery Row, if you know that area, you know that it has been altered over time, and that doesn't necessarily look like this picture. There had been interventions, and there had been buildings that had been lost, and there had been buildings that had been altered that didn't reflect the period of significance. And so in thinking about this entire row as a district required some creativity in thinking about the resources. There were some, like this one, that was fairly intact, although used for a completely different purpose at the time. And there had been, as I mentioned, some pretty heavy interventions. This is a modern hotel at the very end of Cannery Row. So it was at the end, so it wasn't smack in the middle. But one of the things that we were able to do was think about this particular district in terms of some smaller districts. So we didn't identify a single district. We found several clusters, two of which at the southern end of the row were California Register eligible only because of integrity issues, whereas two on the northern end were eligible for the National Register because they actually had a greater level of integrity. And that was sort of the way that we ended up defining the district there. And in other cases, having the benefit of updating a historic resource survey can allow you to consider properties that may have achieved significance since the survey was originally conducted. Or maybe they've become 50 years old or 45 years old since the original survey was conducted. I know a lot of those late 80s surveys don't really look at the buildings from the early 50s or early 60s because they weren't yet within the time frame of the sort of 50-year rule. And so many of these are resources in the modern movement, and not to get back to focusing on just architecture, but in this case, the work of a master was overlooked because it wasn't immediately identifiable or evident that it was a resource. So the building on this slide is a hospital building in San Francisco, designed by Eric Mendelsohn, a well-known modernist architect, who left Germany to go to England in the 30s, and then he came to the United States at the beginning of World War II, and he designed this hospital building in 1946. He's also known for designing the Russell House, and if you look at the two buildings, you can see, I'm going to try to use this arrow. Look, where it came right there. The rounded edge of this residential building that he designed is incredibly similar to the rounded edge of these balcony edges. Moving on. And unfortunately, the building has been pretty severely altered over time. It did have a plaza in the front that you can see here. And over time, the balconies actually were changed a little bit, and this row of balconettes at the very end is really what you can see today. You can see that it's hidden by a very new part of the hospital, that a new pavilion got built in the front, sort of decimating the plaza, and that the balconies have been altered over time to accommodate different uses. Can we get rid of that? So that building wasn't, I'm going to go back one slide, that building wasn't necessarily found or mentioned in any survey projects that had been done in San Francisco before, but because project at the hospital resulted in a better understanding of the resources that the hospital owned. So understanding new significance, this could also include a use that's become 50 years in age since the previous survey, or an important person that worked at the site within the last 50 years. So those types of evaluations, we have a better sense now of how to complete those and what type of criteria and evaluation goes into that kind of update to a survey. A good example of this is this little building out in the Sunset in San Francisco, which was the home to the Henry Dolger Builders and Company. You know, an really interesting architectural piece that we probably would pick up in a survey, but it also has an important person affiliated with it. Henry Dolger was, as he's been phrased, the poor man's Frank Lloyd Wright. He built large tracts of low-cost housing in Northern California, these sort of famous little boxes, and no, I'm not gonna sing that song. But you know, this obviously is an interesting little Art Deco gem that we would pick up in a survey for architecture. But because the building had a change of use and there was none of the signage left on it, we might not necessarily know that it had been used by a very important San Francisco business. So many times we use an update to a resource survey to partner or to go in concert with a planning project, such as a neighborhood or an area plan. And survey information can certainly be a very important part of informing a planning process for a particular neighborhood or a particular part of a larger piece of a city. And a good example of that recently is that the city of Berkeley completed a downtown area plan. It was a very extensive, very exhaustive planning process that ultimately went as a referendum to the voters. But you know, it merged ideas and overlaid planning tools such as land use, historic preservation, urban design, streetscape design, open space, housing, and economic development, so that all of these factors were an underlying planning effort that went into looking at the downtown holistically. And as part of that, there was a downtown survey and a set of context about the commercial downtown that was developed. And that informed then a mapping exercise that if you look at the, I'm going to use the tool again here, if you look at the buildings that are colored, or the lots that are colored, which color is it? This one. No, this one. Sorry. The red are potential development sites that could then be just clearly mapped and clearly understood within the context of the entire downtown. And of course, Berkeley has a lot of landmarks, so they are all mapped in this darker red color here, or the brown color. And through this entire process, several sites were identified as potential development sites. And now, of course, you know, 2007, 2008, that was the downturn of the economy. Now that the economy is back in California and going full force, these development sites are beginning to actually take shape. So the planning process is working in a lot of different ways. I think one of the hardest things to think about when you're planning to do a survey is how to fund it. And that goes back to that very first slide that I had, which talked about the conversation with the planning director and the historic resource planner saying, you know, we really need to fund this. And it's very difficult. Although now that the economy is picking up, I think cities will have more income readily available in the general fund, and advocating for that to go to preservation efforts at the local level would be a very good thing. Certified local government grants can offset the cost of a survey, but often they can't fund the entire project. So it's important to think about and be creative about ways that you can spend your money efficiently in terms of doing a survey. And you know, I think a good strategy for updating can be to sort of phase that work through time and identify and prioritize the areas that have either never been surveyed before, or there are neighborhoods or areas of the city or the town that you know have extensive development pressure, and to focus efforts in those locations, and try to fund you know, smaller scale efforts that would accumulate to a full citywide survey. And you know, especially in cities that are large in scale, phasing a survey is really the only way to go about doing a project like this. It's very difficult to undergo an entire citywide survey. It's always been interesting to me that this project in San Francisco that I referenced earlier was called it was 1976. It was called the 1976 Citywide Architectural Survey, and it, yes, it might have been citywide, but it was definitely not comprehensive, and it was definitely very architecture focused. So the cultural aspect and the sort of thinking about districts and the neighborhood aspect didn't actually occur with that project. So just happened to be doing a project in Fresno now, and it's a portion, tiny portion of the city. Fresno is pretty sprawling, but it will focus on an area that has never been previously surveyed, and so it will be a good update to their collection of surveys throughout the city and understanding a more industrial side of Fresno's past. So that's the end of my song to Jan, who is do a little more focused look at actual projects that have cities that have updated their surveys in recent years. So Jan.
Hello everybody, this is Jan, and I've done surveys throughout California and the country, but primarily my focus in the last probably 10 years, 12 years has been in Southern California, so I'm going to be some of the examples that I give are going to be specific to Southern California, but nonetheless, the application is still the same no matter where you're at. So let me move over to my first slide here. And we've got a lot of surveys that are quite old, and hence this idea for this webinar, and I'm working on a couple of them as we speak. And Bridget kind of went over when is a survey too old, and there's a couple of reasons. One specifically has to do with the Public Resource Code that says surveys should be updated regularly, basically about every 5 years. And we know that's not necessarily the case as we see surveys that are 20, 30 years old. I don't want to belabor it, but there's a number of reasons why surveys need to be updated. And basically the bottom line of this bulleted outline here is to ensure local planning decisions are made on the most current information, particularly since CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, has really raised to a level having to do with historic properties, historic resources, and the review and scrutiny of those properties in light of CEQA. So it's very important for a number of different reasons, and particularly for the CEQA implications. So things to consider about when you're thinking about updating your survey, or even looking at your current survey or other communities' surveys, because not everybody does it the same way. So when was it done? Was it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago? How was the survey completed? Depending on who did the survey, and that is down at the bottom here of my little list of who, where, when, and why. Volunteers could have done it, the city staff could have done it, consultants could have done it, but how was it done? And were there criteria applied? What was the criteria applied? And that's kind of like going to the next step of what was done, how was it done, where was it done? Bridget had mentioned doing it in phases, and some cities have done surveys by neighborhood, by property type, by location in a city. So where was it done in the community? Industrial? Was it primarily residential? Why was it done? Was it for a local planning process, or was it done to appease the local community and volunteers? And again, who did it? Particularly now that we do have standards of professional qualifications that a lot of communities in their RFPs are looking for the firms and individuals who qualify under the Secretary of the Interior standards for professional qualifications. So there's a lot of things to kind of think about and look at with your past surveys and moving forward to updating or even conducting new surveys. So who has old surveys? I've just listed just a few. And Long Beach, down here in Southern California, has a survey, did a wasn't necessarily a citywide survey, but they surveyed a lot of neighborhoods. And in those surveys, they did some inventory forms. There was an old version of the DPR form. And in other surveys, what they did was print out, go to the tax assessor records and print out the data information, took a photograph and attached it onto that piece of paper and called it their inventory sheet. And that was it. But Long Beach, the survey dates from the early 1980s to mid-1980s. Beverly Hills, currently working with the team to update that survey, and that citywide survey was done back in 1985, 86. Laguna Beach, also working currently on updating that survey, and that was done back in 1981, 1982. And how that was done was a whole different methodology that was quite unique to Orange County because of the surveyors who were conducting that survey at the time. They came up with a whole kind of criteria and category or rating status for properties that were quite unique to Orange County. Santa Ana also has that same kind of rating system and evaluation process. Santa Monica, their survey dated from the mid-80s as well. And of these that I've listed, Santa Ana has started updating in various areas of their community their survey. Santa Monica just completed a few years ago their survey, so it's the citywide survey, so it's quite up to date today. Laguna Beach, like I said, is currently in the process. Beverly Hills is currently in the process. And Long Beach is looking at their historic districts and maybe reevaluating them, but that's about the extent of it. And I'm sure there's many others down here in Southern California, Central California, and up in Northern California. So as an example, a working example, I thought I'd talk about Laguna Beach because it is rather unique in the community itself and also in the process that the survey had back in the 80s, how that was conducted, and then moving forward with the community's concerns, staff concerns, and they don't have a commission, they have a committee. It's on an advisory perspective. It's the Heritage Committee. So currently that city has a survey, as I've mentioned, and it dates from 1980-81. They also have a historic resources element in their general plan, which is great, and that is quite old as well and quite minimal in its content and information. They have an ordinance that was in place in 89, which is based off the process of the survey that was conducted. And then they have a whole program, and it's staffed by an individual who also works in the zoning department. So her role is many hats, and doing the historic preservation work is just one of them. But they have a review process. They have a historic register that the properties can get listed on. They have a heritage committee, like I said, that reviews landmark designations and projects for alteration and modification. They have a Mills Act contract program, and they have other incentives that include zoning variances and the like. They also review properties, particularly now, those that are on the register, and something called the inventory, and the inventory was derived from the survey, the early survey. So those properties on the inventory or that have been formally designated on the historic register go through a CEQA review. And in doing the update survey currently for this community, I requested a printout, the Historic Resources Inventory, from the Information Center at Cal State Fullerton that's operated with oversight from the State Office of Historic Preservation. And when I got that back, the whole community had been listed as contributors to a potential district. So all those properties that had been surveyed, and not every property had been surveyed that's located in Laguna Beach, but those that had been, all had a 5D3 or 5D2, and so pretty much meant that the whole city was a historic district, which it wasn't really necessarily the case. So that was one big thing that we had to address too and correct. The inventory work that was done, identified 852 properties. The cutoff date when that survey was done was 1942. So obviously, since it's been 30 years since that initial survey, that 30-year span has added a lot of new properties. The one thing, though, about the survey update we're doing is that we're only updating those properties that were previously surveyed. So that means that 30-year span of new properties that have acquired that potential 50-year, 45, 50-year span, or age, is not being looked at under this current survey. Neither are any of the properties that weren't looked at, or that were not looked at, excuse me, under that initial survey. So they were able to get funding from the council to approve a survey update to only update their current inventory of known resources. And that survey was done on, so to speak, street forms, which was a plain piece of paper with a photograph and a 1 or 2 sentence paragraph saying what the description of the property is. And then it was assigned a status code of either an E, K, or C. It was either an E for exceptional, which meant that it was eligible for the National Register. K, it was quite significant for its architectural features. And C, one would think it had to do with the historic district, but it really had to do with more of a local architectural style or being associated with within a neighborhood. And then this whole survey was actually recognized by resolution by the City Council in 1982. So this is the map that is on their website, because they posted all the information and all the survey forms and things on the website. They're all in DPR or PDF format that you can pull down. And they've listed it by neighborhood. And so they've outlined it, each neighborhood, and then where you see black little markings, those are the properties that they decided, they being the surveyors that conducted the survey in 1981, they decided which properties would get a form, one of those street forms with a photograph. So you can see there were a lot of properties that weren't picked up throughout the whole city. And how these neighborhoods were defined isn't clear either, because there wasn't necessarily a final report that went with the survey. So here's the classification that the city uses. And this classification currently is used in the city for properties that are listed on the register for incentive purposes. So the higher rating code that you have, the more that you have as far as variances, parking reduction, ease in setbacks and things like that. In doing this, in having this rating code, the city has found that there's been some complications, and actually when we started the survey, the properties themselves were kind of questionable. And not all of them did they merit either an E, K, or C rating. So the city wanted us to develop and revise their historic context. They kind of sort of have a historic context in their preservation element. That's part of the general plan. We re-identified and evaluated the properties on the inventory. We also then, which hadn't been done before, overlaid a level of integrity and applied the 7 qualities of integrity to these re-evaluated properties. We also applied the National Register, the California Register, and the local criteria, which the city has, to each of the properties being re-evaluated. And then the city wanted us to study the use of this EKC rating classification, and they wanted to be more consistent with how OHP does their survey methodologies and how other cities do their surveys and assign status codes. And really it should be based and is now being converted to the status codes that OHP uses, which are those codes from 1 to 7 to identify the significance of a property. And that's this here. And then those status codes then parallel with CEQA and the CEQA review that goes on there in the community. So our scope of work, Typical of any survey, kickoff meetings, collect historical data on the properties and get all the form information, get the context for anything that is close to being a historic context so that we can kind of look at it and meld it into a historic context that's consistent now of OHP methodology. We did a field survey, windshield survey, intensive level survey, photographed all the properties, reevaluated the significance of the already identified properties, already inventoried properties. We put everything into an Access database that created a spreadsheet and also generated all the DPR forms. So now what they're going to be getting, what the city's going to be getting, is a more sophisticated survey that is consistent again with how OHP recommends now in doing surveys. And so they have updated DPR forms, updated photographs. They'll ultimately get a survey findings report that it will include recommendations, such as including those properties that have never been surveyed before. And all of this process involves public meetings and public outreach. So we've had a number of public meetings. We've touched base with the Heritage Committee. They have a design review board that sometimes gets involved with projects. And we've also worked with the City Council on this whole project. So there's the survey process, there's a reassessment of evaluation codes, status codes, and also then how that affects their current preservation ordinance. So here's the field work again. The scope of work was pretty consistent with what one does for a survey. The updated of the context, there's a number of reasons to update or formulate a context if your survey doesn't have a historic context. It establishes registration thresholds as one key factor, which then helps to evaluate appropriately the significance of property. In architectural styles, it identifies common architectural styles, which Laguna Beach has some rather unique features that kind of are rather specific and unique to Laguna Beach in materials and design. Criteria, like I said, National Register criteria has been overlaid, the California Register, and the City of Laguna Beach, which also has criteria. And the criteria is actually very similar to that of most cities, and that, again, that's recommended by the OHP methodology and rather consistent with the state and National Register criteria. The overlay of integrity is quite important, because since that early 1980 survey, a lot of things have changed. Some buildings have been totally removed. Some have been extensively remodeled. And the key features of integrity that we found having to do with Laguna Beach is association. Laguna Beach is very well known for its art colony. A lot of known artists, painters, sculptors moved to Laguna Beach at the early 1900s. The Pageant of the Masters started early in the first quarter of the 20th century there, and a lot of other things having to do with arts and aesthetics. And so associations, when we're looking at the cultural aspect and association with historic personages, was rather important for this community because the properties might have been owned and developed and lived in by artists and used as artist studios. Materials was a big key factor of how they were used and where they were used. Again, quite unique to Laguna Beach, where construction techniques and materials, which associated then with its design. Of the survey, from the 1980-81 survey, we had 216 key contributing properties, 244 key, 70 exceptional, and 6 of them we found out didn't have any status codes. From the update survey, and after applying the criteria, integrity, and all that other good stuff, OHP status codes and things, this is the survey update on the right column is kind of how things shook out. So kind of a big difference in the C contributed properties, that big change, and then also ones that were identified as not necessarily being historic. This right here where we didn't have any before. So out of that bigger pool, 87 of them weren't necessarily historic on any level, and then we did have 9 of them that have been totally demolished and the sites have been redeveloped. And then of that bigger pool of properties, 19 within that 30-year span had been placed on the register. So there's a number of reasons for the changes of why our findings were such. Bridget kind of talked about the different policies and regulations and things that have come into play since the 1980s, such as the California Register of Historical Resources. The status codes, which were initially called the National Register Status Codes, had changed in 2003 to the California Historical Status Codes and kind of changed interpretation of some of the properties that were once evaluated. And then again, the overlay of the CEQA implications that we had to consider as well. So we had to take the current OHP status codes and overlay it with the E, K, and C ratings of the city. And this table kind of tells you where things shook out on that, those findings. So ultimately, I get my little arrow here. There we go. The E's, which were eligible for the National Register, there were 4. The 5S3s, which were still kind of exceptional for Laguna Beach standards, 64. T, 213. We found a little grouping of buildings that we kind of called a local district. And then those C's really kind of, didn't have the quality, the architectural value, the integrity, the design, or any associations to really merit anything higher to a 5 level of the OHP status codes. But some of them did have something to them, so we didn't want to wash them away completely, so that what was once called a 5S3 under the old status codes was changed to a 6L. So we dropped those properties, which were primarily the C-rated properties, down to the 6L category. And then ultimately what shook out as not being historic at all were 87 properties. So what do we do about the 6L category? And why I say that is after we met with staff and we met with the public and we met with the Heritage Committee, they wanted to know, we love those C properties, even if they may not necessarily be historic. We don't want them to just be able to go by the wayside. So we ended up, in consideration of the OHP status codes, the current status codes, and CEQA, and this is still in the works. We're still moving forward after a number of meetings with the council and staff and planning director and the public. So at this point, what we're recommending is developing a second layer of significance called structures of merit. So for those properties that were identified as either eligible for local designation, eligible for California or National Register status, which in the light of Laguna Beach status codes were either E or K, we assign them a status code of a 5S in the 5 category. And those that were C, that I had mentioned, we rated them as a 6L and we called them a structure of merit so that they at least on the radar screen and that possibly they may get some benefits or incentives. The city has yet to determine that. But it's really to streamline that process. So if anybody comes as a property owner and they want to make some changes, then it would be an easier process to do that. And ultimately, we're also recommending that the structures of merit be exempt from CEQA compliance. With that, with those changes being proposed, we're also making changes to the ordinance to reflect the OHP status codes that we're now transitioning to, and we're rather with the city to get rid of that EKC system. And the ordinance has no effect to or any similarity to when it comes to review or even significance to the OHP methodologies in the status code. So we're updating the ordinance to reflect the changes that we're proposing and that will ultimately get adopted and approved, or approved and adopted by the city, and thus therefore we can finalize the ordinance. But the ordinance is getting modified to reflect that structure of merit, designation criteria, process, and then review of such property. So the next steps, and we have a meeting next week with the City Council to present again this process is to continue working with the staff and the public on addressing the preservation policies and programs that the city has, streamlining the CEQA review as much as possible, and then finalizing our findings, our reports, our forms in the database, come back and present everything in a final format to the public, the Heritage Committee, and the Council, and then finalize the database, which includes the forms, like I said, photographs, and all the data information, which the city can then put into their GIS system, and then post everything to their website. And then currently what we're doing is working on a process of how to currently and in the future review projects as they come forward to the counter at the city for modifications and designations of properties. So with a lot of information, but thank you.
Can I ask a question? I don't know if anybody can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, great. I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I guess I was confused about the EKC codes. Is that part of the new survey going on, or you're trying to update those?
Well, we were confused too at first, but no, we are trying to get away from that system and make it more consistent with how OHP wants or recommends having surveys done, and how to categorize the significance of properties with their California Register status codes from 1 to 7.
Can you tell me what OHP means?
The Office of Historic Preservation, sorry, up in Sacramento.
Oh, okay.
It's where SHPO is, the State Historic Preservation Officer.
Okay, and since I'm on the line there, could I wanted to also ask, how long have you been working on the survey, and when do you expect it to be finished, or is it finished?
It's not finished. It's close to being finished. There's a couple of hurdles that we've had to cross over, and there was a lot to be done, and so the city was ambitious to have it done within a year. And since we are totally, or I shouldn't say totally, but substantially reorganizing and readdressing their processes of designation, recognition, and then review, it's taken a little bit longer. So we're ultimately looking at finishing up this summer, the whole thing. But again, we're going forward to council on Tuesday, and it's a matter of what we hear from them, where it might take us. So.
Okay, well, thanks for your question, and Melissa, if you didn't have any other questions, right?
No, but I'm still not clear. When did the survey start?
About a year and a half. About a year and a half ago.
Okay, and you might be finished within the year and a half, depending on what happens this week.
It's this summer, this coming summer.
Oh, okay, this summer. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. There's a lot of things that come into play. For instance, Beverly Hills, we're also updating that survey, and we were making great strides in finalizing that, except that the council, as of the beginning of the year, or end of the year, last year, wanted to overhaul the ordinance, preservation ordinance, so it put a stop on the survey update, because if they do change it, which includes changing the criteria and the process of identification of potential resources, then that survey work that we've done would all need to be looked at and kind of readdress them. So you just never know what might happen.
Okay, great. So we can take more questions too later. I know Melissa had a second question box, but I'll wait until the Q&A period to address that one. At this point, I'm going to start Amy's presentation, and we should be done here right on time.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Amy Mintier, and I'm a partner at Chatton Brown & Carson. And we're a law firm that focuses on environmental and land use law, in particular CEQA petitioners' work. So my part of the presentation is going to focus on the importance of surveys and updating those surveys from a legal perspective. So historical resources surveys provide an important tool to help identify and protect historic resources. In particular, because there's no legal restriction on the age of the resources that can be identified. These surveys are important for identifying and protecting more recent resources, such as modern buildings and landscapes. Other registers do have some restrictions on age. For example, the National Register, in contrast, it includes what is referred to as the 50-year rule. And this is a rule that's set forth in the Code of Federal Regulations, which states that ordinarily properties that have achieved significance within the past 50 years shall not be considered eligible for the National Register. And this includes not only resources that were constructed within the past 50 years, but also resources that are over 50 years old, but did not achieve significance until less than 50 years before they're being nominated for the National Register, either due to their association with an event or a person in the last 50 years. And the reason given for this rule is that 50 years is a general estimate of the amount of time needed to develop historical perspective and to adequately evaluate the significance of resources before they should be listed on the National Register. There is an exception to this 50-year rule. It does not apply to all resources, or it does not prohibit all resources that are less than 50 years old from being listed on the National Register. The exception states that a property that has achieved its significance within the past 50 years can be listed if it is of exceptional importance. This exception isn't applied very often. Only about 3% of the resources on the National Register fall under this exception. And some examples of this are properties that were associated with exceptionally important historic events, such as the launch pad at Cape Canaveral, or the Monroe School in Topeka, Kansas, which is now known as the Brown versus Board of Education National Historic Site. Those are both listed less than 50 years after the significant events associated with them occurred. And also homes of exceptionally important persons, such as the home of Rachel Carson, where she wrote Silent Spring, and the home of playwright Eugene O'Neill. And then also buildings of exceptional architectural importance or that demonstrate important feats of engineering can be listed under this exception. An example of that is the Chrysler Building, which was added to the National Register when it was, I believe, about 48 years old. The California Register also requires an additional showing before resources less than 50 years old can be listed. The regulations setting the criteria for listing on the California Register state that in order to understand the historic importance of a resource, sufficient time must have passed to obtain a scholarly perspective on the events or individuals associated with the resource. A resource less than 50 years old may be considered for listing in the California Register if it can be demonstrated that sufficient time has passed to understand its historical importance. So preparing a historic resources survey can have many benefits. The first of which is that it can include resources that are less than 50 years old and does not include a requirement to determine that resources are of exceptional importance or that there's been an adequate amount of scholarly research on the resource before a less than 50-year-old resource can be listed. And this is important to allow cities to evaluate resources built less than 50 years ago and to provide protections for those resources. Surveys can also help in setting local land use policy. As Jan was discussing is the case in Laguna Beach, the survey is informing how the local land use policy and preservation policies are being developed within the city. Also, local land use policies may provide protections for resources that are determined by a survey to be significant, such as requiring review by a historic preservation commission before alteration or demolition, or just specific limits on when the resource can be demolished. Surveys are also important to be used for identifying resources for local registers of historic resources. And, oops, I'm sorry, too quick there. And finally, they're important, or the fourth point here, that they're important in adding resources to the California Register. If a survey has been prepared and submitted to the Office of Historic Preservation, the resources listed on it can then be placed onto the California Register. But to qualify for that, the survey must use the OHP standards for resource recording, and the survey must be less than 5 years old or updated within the last 5 years, and the resources must be categories 1 through 4. And those should be considered for listing. Categories 5, which are resources of local importance, can also be considered for listing on the California Register based on an adequate survey. Know that tax reductions are also available for qualified historical properties, and this includes resources that are listed in a city or county register of significant resources. And some cities do allow Mills Act contracts for resources that were identified by the Historic Resources Survey. The use of the state historical building codes is another benefit for qualified historic resources that may be identified by a Historic Resource Survey. This building code provides alternative regulations for repairs and alterations and additions and changes in use for qualified historic buildings, which include resources that were identified by an official city inventory, and a city's Historic Resource Survey could qualify as an official inventory. And finally, the area the Historic Resources Surveys can be very important is review of projects under the California Environmental Quality Act. The effects of a resource being listed in a survey can greatly impact how environmental review process will move forward for that resource. And that is because under CEQA, a project is considered to have a significant impact on the environment if it may cause a substantial adverse change in the significance of an historical resource. And CEQA requires that an EIR be prepared if a project would have a significant impact on a resource, on a historic resource. And a project that would have an adverse effect on a historic resource, such as a project that would demolish or materially alter a historic resource, can only be approved if there are no feasible alternatives that would avoid or mitigate the impacts to that resource. So based on this, the important initial determination is whether the resource is considered to be a historical resource under CEQA, and surveys can serve an important purpose in that, making that determination. Under CEQA, there are 3 categories of historic resources, and CEQA considers any resource that is listed or has been officially determined eligible for listing on the national or California registers. Those resources have to be considered historic resources under CEQA, and impacts to those resources must be considered significant. The second category is where the surveys come in, and these are the presumptive resources. If a resource is included in a local register, or if it's identified as significant in a Historic Resources Survey that meets certain qualifications set forth in Public Resources Code Section 5024.1G, then public agencies must treat that resource as a significant historic resource unless the preponderance of evidence demonstrates that it will not historically, or that it is not historically or culturally significant. And this is a difficult standard to overcome. It's basically would only, the presumption could only be overcome in instances where there have been material alterations that have eliminated the historic significance of property, or other significant changes in our understanding of that property that eliminate its historic significance. And the final category is discretionary. And these are for resources that haven't been listed in any register or in a survey, and they could still be considered significant historic resources but if there is enough evidence of the historic significance, but they're not required to be. Oh, there we go. So the important question is, what makes for a qualified survey to get that city's historic resources survey into that presumptive category for the resources listed on it? There are 4 requirements. The first is that the survey must be included in the State Historic Resources Inventory. So that just means that the survey should be submitted to OHP or to the appropriate local California Historic Resource Information Center, which allows for the comprehensive inventory of resources throughout the state. The second requirement is that the survey and the survey documentation must be prepared in accordance with office procedures and requirements. And this means that the survey needs to be carried out in accordance with the Secretary of Interior's standards for preservation planning, identification, evaluation, and registration, and should comply with the associated guidelines. Additionally, the person preparing the survey should meet the Secretary of Interior's professional qualification standards. The third requirement for a qualified survey is that the resource being evaluated must be evaluated and determined to have a significance rating of category 1 through 5 on the DPR form 523. These categories were discussed a little bit earlier, but category 5 is of particular importance here. This is where this is for resources that are of local interest. In particular, category 5S3 provides that a resource is historic when it appears to be individually eligible for local listing or designation through survey evaluation. And the final qualification, which is why it's very important to have an updated survey, is that the survey must have been prepared or updated within the past 5 years. Public Resources Code states that this is so that the survey has evaluated which resources become ineligible due to changed circumstances, or if there's been further documentation that shows either eligibility or ineligibility of resources, and it takes into consideration demolitions and alterations. So there have been 2 secret cases dealt with resources listed on a city historic resources survey, and have very differing results. And so I'd like to kind of wrap up with a discussion of these 2 different cases that show the differences in the use of surveys and the importance of having an updated survey. In Lease for Protection of Oakland's historic resources, the City of Oakland proposed demolition of the Montgomery Ward building. And this building was built in the 1920s, and it was the largest industrial building in Oakland and the first branch of Montgomery Ward in California. And although it had been designed as a warehouse, it had quite a few architecturally significant features to it. The building was vacant and in serious disrepair when the city proposed a redevelopment project that would demolish it and build a shopping center in its place. And the city approved the demolition and construction project based upon a mitigated negative declaration. That MND found that mitigation measures, such as documenting Montgomery Ward building, installing a plaque, and building the new building in a similar design, mitigated the impacts of demolition to a less than significant level. Preservation Group brought a CEQA action claiming that the building should have been considered historic, and based on that they objected to the demolition of the Montgomery Ward building. And to show that it was historically significant, they cited to the city's Cultural Heritage Survey that had determined the building eligible for National Register listing due to its major historical importance. And the court found that based on the survey findings, the Montgomery Ward building was a presumptively historic resource under CEQA and was required to be considered a historic resource under that presumptive category. And because CEQA requires a finding that demolition of a historic resource is a significant adverse impact, the court found that the city could not approve the demolition and construction project based on the MND. They had to prepare an EIR to analyze those impacts. In a different result, Citizens for Responsible Development in West Hollywood, there was a project to construct low-income housing for persons with AIDS, and the project was going to restore 2 craftsman buildings on the property that were locally designated as part of a historic district and that the city recognized as historic resources. There were 4 other buildings on the property that were not included in the historic district and that the city did not consider to be historic resources. These buildings were to be demolished as part of the project. And the city prepared a M&D to analyze the project. Community group objected to the demolition, brought a CEQA lawsuit, and claiming that the 4 buildings should also be considered historic resources under CEQA, and then the EIR should be prepared to analyze those impacts. The court found, or here the buildings had been, that were scheduled for demolition, those buildings had been identified in a 1987 survey as historic resources, but the survey was more than 5 years old. And the court found that even though they were determined to be historically significant in a historic resources survey prepared by the city, because the survey was more than 5 years old and had not been updated in the past 5 years, the buildings were not presumptively historically significant, and they thus fell into the discretionary category of historic significance, and the city was able to make that determination that they were not historically significant. And because of that, no EIR was required for the analysis of the demolition of those buildings. And so that concludes the speaking on. But I did want to raise one point in response to a question that Bridget raised earlier about funding. And it was just an idea that came to me when you were thinking about that, but is that in where there are going to be impacts to historic resources, it's possible the city could set up some type of mitigation fund, and as a mitigation measure, developers or people that are looking to demolish or alter buildings with historic significance could be required to pay into that fund, and that fund could be used to...
And Amy, that's a good point. In the city of Long Beach, they did do that, and with the loss of a building, and they were mitigated to $3 million. And so then the Heritage Committee, or Heritage Commission, excuse me, Cultural Heritage Commission for the city can allocate every year, look at and agendize, kind of prioritize what they want to do with that money, and it's funded updating of a preservation element. It's updated for historic citywide historic context statement and some other work. So such a funny mechanism. Seems bad on the initially because it has to deal with demolition ultimately of loss of resources, but for future it does actually benefit a greater whole. So.
Yeah, Amy, I think that's a great point, and I know there are other cities that have that kind of mechanism as a mitigation for the loss of historic resources. And even in the case of San Francisco, we had a number of years ago sort of partial accidental demolition of the old Emporium building as part of a larger project, and there was a fairly large settlement that came out of that mistake that formed what we call now in the city the Preservation Fund Committee. So it was a substantial chunk of change that went into a permanent fund.
And also, I've done a survey. I did one out in the city of Riverside where they use CDBG funds to fund part of their survey, depending on the area that the survey was located in.
On that note, this is John. Another question came up about whether CLG grants are still available, and if so, what's the maximum amount? Does anybody in the room know that?
I know it's varied year to year. I think what the last I heard was... Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. Go ahead. You go, Jan.
Oh, I was just going to say, you go, Jan.
No, sorry.
I had heard, I've seen up to, that's okay, I've seen up to 50,000, but they've really cut back in the last several years with that funding. So CLG grants are still available. They have to be matched by whoever the entity is receiving that money. But it doesn't cover typically you don't get the whole amount that you've requested, has been my experience.
Yeah, I would say in the last 5 years, I don't think I've seen many CLG grants that are over $25,000, and then that has to be matched by the city. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so what I'm going to do, because we had a large number of questions, probably the most questions we've ever had for a webinar before, so I'm going to try to move through them as quickly as possible, and hopefully we'll make it through all of them. The first question is, how do you determine who could, I think this was in relation to what Bridget was saying about one of the buildings she was using as a case example.
Yeah, I mean, it can be somewhat tricky. You know, their buildings and resources can be eligible at the local, the state, and the federal level. So, you know, there may be a very significant local architect. I mean, what's coming to my mind off the top of my head is in Palo Alto, there was a long-standing architect, Burge Clark, and he designed innumerable buildings in the city, and they're very important local resources to the city, and he would be considered a master architect in Palo Alto. He may not have had the same impact. He may have built a couple buildings in neighboring cities, but he didn't have the same impact in those cities, so maybe he wouldn't be considered a master architect, say, in Burlingame if he'd done a building or two there. So you have to kind of weigh weigh their entire body of work within the context of the community's history.
The other thing about the master architect, which can be expanded beyond an architect, it could be a builder, contractor, or craftsman, but that basic definition and understanding of what that means is actually defined at the National Register level in what's called the National Register Bulletins, and there's one particularly called the How to Apply the National Register Criteria, and that bulletin actually defines what a building is, a structure, object, site is. It defines what historic integrity is, and then it also defines what a historic district is, and as well as what a master architect, craftsman, builder, and the like is as well. So that's really kind of where that initial definition is, and then how you overlay it at a national level, a state level, or a local level has to do with who that individual is and their quality of work and where they worked and how they worked, so on and so forth.
Okay, great. Second question, how much weight does cultural heritage or events that happened at a site have in terms of significance?
Well, it's Bridget. I think it would, again, you have to sort of weigh the context of the event. So, just trying to think of a good example. So, say, for instance, in San Francisco, the 1906 earthquake is a major event in the city's, obviously in the city's history, and so resources that are somehow associated with that event, and they could be resources that were, they could be part of the rebuild after the 1906 earthquake, or they could be resources that survived the 1906 earthquake, or they could be a grouping of resources that are right at the fire line that was generated by the earthquake. And then in terms of events, sort of more specific events like you've had a recent controversy in San Francisco over a building that's related to the 1933 labor strikes, and whether or not what happened in that particular building was integral to that day's events, and how it related to labor history. So you know, the best thing to do is, if you're feeling like it's a wishy-washy, you know, kind of one, you could go one way or the other, I tend to just like talk to my colleagues or talk to my peers and say, okay, would you think that this is an important event within this context as it relates to this particular building, and bounce it off, you know, a couple people's, you know, let's get some different comments about it before you go kind of out to a bigger audience.
Great. Okay.
And I should say.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to just expand on that a little bit too. As far as the criteria goes, because there's soft criteria, as I call it, and hard criteria. That having to do physically with the building, and then that having to do with it internally or periphery. And the historical aspects of it, the cultural aspects of it, the criteria, it's all of the same playing field. So whether you're applying the criteria for cultural aspects or historical events or architectural value, that criteria should be looked at all the same, but how you either evaluate it and get to your finding of significance or insignificance, that's where you should actually then start vetting your research information and collecting it all and disseminating it and interpreting it to get to your findings.
Great. Melissa was asking, when our city seems to have no interest in area plans and take a haphazard approach, what suggestions might you have to make them see the light and start conducting a survey? And is that a good idea? Does it make
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, I think that in terms of, like, just to give the example of the downtown Berkeley area plan that I talked about, I think one thing that was very important for a lot of the business owners in downtown was they wanted to know, is it historic or is it not historic? Is it important? Is it not important? And how does that relate to how they wanted to develop? It resonates with, you know, in a lot of communities. The level of uncertainty when you don't have a survey can actually dissuade people from doing certain things or making plans for certain properties. So having that information readily available can actually be an economic development tool, because you can say to a developer, well, we already know that there are no historic resources on the site. You know, similarly, so that you could say to them, well, we already know that there's no endangered species on this particular site. So it's a combination of factors that a developer is going to think about when they think about a property. If they know that there's a known historic resource there and that the community is very attached to that particular resource, and there's no way to, you know, kind of think about that site without that resource being there, they're not going to present a project that doesn't, you know, retain the resource.
And that's a good point. It's from a developer's perspective, by knowing what you have out there, it's an efficiency process. It streamlines that review process, and also that I know that's always a win-win situation when it comes to the developer.
And I guess it would be the fourth question from Steve. He's asking, are there any particular recommendations for updating surveys and inventories at the county level?
Depending on your county, I know it's quite large. They can be quite large, and so maybe, as Richard had said, to phase the survey, look at this, if there's a hotbed of development going on, pressure to demolish, maybe that kind of would focus good to survey, and then just take it in small chunks. Then, because money is a driving factor, and if it's too big, it's difficult to get it funded. So I would say maybe looking at that approach.
Yeah, and I know I mean, years ago I did some work in Tuolumne County up north, and the more rural counties sometimes have sort of more like township sites that where you have clusters of resources where you can sort of efficiently survey them. And I know that was their approach. They were doing the different little townships. And counties can be CLG participants as well, certified local governments as well. And some counties don't realize that, so that's a good thing to know.
Okay, so here's a longer question with the story first. David is saying, our situation is similar to Laguna's. We have over 1,000 properties on a local register based on a survey done in 1980, and although it is basically a neighborhood survey, everything was considered contributing to the neighborhood. No specific designation of significance was given. We do not have the staffing or volunteers to redo the old survey, and are focusing instead on the resources from the 1940s to the 1960s to identify significant resources. Being on the local register currently only gives a 90-day delay of demolition and ability to utilize the Mills Act. Is there any way to give the old survey resources a generic OHP status code, or do we just have to redo the survey when there are the resources to do so?
So do those old properties that were evaluated have old status codes? Would be my first question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's clear from the question whether they did or not. If David is still in the room, you can type that answer in the chat box, or I could enable your mic.
Well, that's okay. Because if there's old status codes off the State Office of Historic Preservation's website, they have all these technical briefs, and one of the briefs is how to interpret your status codes, your old ones to the new status codes. So you could get that technical brief, overlay your old status codes, and then see what the new status codes shake out to be. I guess that would be the quickest, easiest way of doing that.
Okay, great. Okay, did anybody Okay, great.
Yeah, I mean, it is sort of an exercise of just, oh, sorry. Oh, it's Bridget. I was just going to say it is, I mean, I think Jan's right. It's sort of an exercise of trying to translate the old codes to the new codes, and then also trying to be consistent if you are evaluating new resources to kind of overlay the new codes in a way that is similar to how you thought about the resources that had already been surveyed.
Okay. Okay, so Phyllis is asking, maybe this is a question mainly from Amy because this was posed during her presentation, but Phyllis is saying, isn't it unrealistic to require updates to surveys every 5 years?
I would agree that is most likely unrealistic. I don't know many cities that do that. That is what the code says, and that's how cases have interpreted it. So if we could all join together in proposing a revision to the legislation, that would be great.
Well, and I think that's kind of obvious from some of the examples we've given where they're 20, 30 years old. So obviously, despite the code, the communities still haven't updated them. So.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Other than a few other quick questions that I can address myself, there was one question about what the CLG program is and what CLG stands for, and I posted a link to the website at the SHPO, the Office of Historic Preservation for California, and that program details are on that website. You can always email us or ask any of the speakers for more information. And I can refer you to somebody at the OHP if you need more information than that. So the other question was about the slides for today, whether they'd be available, and I usually make them available within the late afternoon of the same day, so I can email you the PDF of all these slides in case you need them as a resource. We have made a recording of the session. Recording is available for purchase about a day or so after the presentation. and want to thank each of you for registering for today's program. Through your registration fees, you're supporting our very important missions of advocacy and education. And this is the third part of a three-part program for local government. So the former two webinars have been recorded, and I can provide you links to those if you'd like to learn more about them. Other than that, I think we're done, and I wanted to thank my sincerest thanks to Amy, Bridget, and Jan for their time today and all they've done for CPF in the past as well. And with that being said, I wanted to thank everybody and move over to collaboration, or I'm sorry, evaluation. And on this page, you'll notice that there's a multiple choice survey on the left-hand side. That's where you provide your feedback for the program. Please scroll back up to the top of the page and hit the Submit Response button so your responses are received. And then on the bottom of the page are some more of qualitative questions that you can provide written responses to. And you can type in your suggestions for future programs or provide comments on today's webinar. And that is about it. I wanted to invite everybody to next Tuesday's webinar, which will actually look at reality capture. So it's a completely different topic, but I've had a look at the presentation. It shows some really neat technology being used to scan architecture and record it in a three-dimensional format. So if you can, please do make it. If you use the coupon code Advocacy 2015 in all caps, you will receive $15 off on that webinar. And thanks again for all your support. And with that being said, I'm going to turn the sound off, but I'm going to leave this window open for your responses. Thanks again, everybody.